Joe Kennedy built an empire, but one decision haunted him until his dying breath. The patriarch of America's most powerful dynasty lost his soul with a decision made at the height of his career. And from that day forward, no success, no power, no money could free him from the shadow of that choice. Before 1941, Joe Kennedy turned everything he touched to gold with the Midas touch that had made him one of the wealthiest men in America. He made millions on Wall Street through shrewd investments and calculated risks that others were too timid to take. He built film studios in Hollywood, transforming himself from Boston Irish outsider to entertainment mogul. He became ambassador to Great Britain, representing American interests in the most prestigious diplomatic post available. Every plan he conceived worked flawlessly. Every risk he took paid dividends beyond his wildest expectations. He felt invincible, untouchable, capable of bending any situation to his iron will. But his decision about Rosemary was different from every other calculated move he had made in his relentless climb to power. This time, he hadn't run the numbers, hadn't calculated the risk with his usual mathematical precision, hadn't thought through the long-term consequences with the strategic mind that had served him so well in business and politics. He just wanted to solve what he saw as a problem threatening his carefully constructed empire. And this hasty decision would ruin the rest of his life in ways he could never have imagined. In the fall of 1941, Joe Kennedy was under tremendous pressure from multiple directions. Rosemary's uncontrolled behavior was increasing at exactly the wrong time, when the family was positioning itself for greater political influence. She was trying to leave the house at night, wandering the streets of their exclusive neighborhood in her nightgown like some gothic heroine escaped from a Victorian novel. She was not behaving appropriately when important visitors came to discuss business or politics, sometimes interrupting crucial conversations with outbursts that embarrassed the family. And worst of all, from Joe's calculating perspective, she was starting to show interest in men, a development that could lead to scandal, pregnancy, or worse. For Joe Kennedy, this was absolutely unacceptable because it threatened everything he had worked his entire life to build. Protecting the Kennedy family image was more important to him than anything else in the world, more precious than money, more valuable than personal relationships. Family reputation, political future, his children's careers, the dynasty he was building, all of these things depended completely on maintaining a perfect family image that could withstand the scrutiny of voters and critics. Rosemary was threatening this carefully crafted image with every unpredictable outburst, every moment of visible difference. Joe Kennedy began searching desperately for a solution that would eliminate the problem without damaging the family's reputation. He tried special schools run by expensive private institutions, hired the best private tutors money could buy, met with behavior specialists who claimed expertise in managing difficult cases. But none of them could make Rosemary normal in the way he needed her to be normal. She remained unpredictable, remained a liability, remained a threat to everything he had built. Then he met Dr. Walter Freeman, the man who would give him exactly what he thought he wanted. Freeman was presenting lobotomy surgery as a miraculous medical breakthrough, a revolutionary treatment that could cure mental illness and behavioral problems with surgical precision. "We make problematic patients calm and manageable," he promised, with the confidence of someone who had performed the procedure hundreds of times. Joe Kennedy believed this because he desperately wanted to believe it, because Freeman was offering him exactly what he needed: a quick, easy, definitive solution to his Rosemary problem. In his meeting with Freeman, Joe Kennedy made the critical mistake that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He didn't ask Rose for her opinion about major surgery on their daughter, didn't get a second doctor's opinion to verify Freeman's claims, didn't research the risks and potential complications in detail the way he would have for any business investment. He just made the decision with the same authoritarian certainty that had served him well in other areas, but would destroy him here. Rosemary would have the surgery, and it would solve everything. The moment Joe Kennedy made this decision, he unknowingly marked the beginning of his own psychological destruction. The morning after Rosemary's surgery, Joe Kennedy got the phone call that would shatter his carefully constructed world into irreparable pieces. Dr. Freeman's voice was different when he called, hesitant and evasive in a way that immediately set off alarm bells in Joe's mind. "Mr. Kennedy, there were some unexpected complications during the procedure. Your daughter's condition is not quite what we had anticipated." The clinical language couldn't mask the disaster that had occurred in that operating room. When Joe arrived at George Washington University Hospital, moving with the quick, determined stride that had carried him through 1,000 business crises, he saw the magnitude of what he had authorized and immediately understood that he had made the worst mistake of his life. Rosemary couldn't speak coherently, couldn't recognize him as her father, couldn't even control her basic bodily functions. The vibrant young woman who had danced at society parties and laughed with her siblings just days before was gone, replaced by someone who stared blankly at the ceiling with vacant eyes that held no trace of the person she had once been. Joe Kennedy realized in that horrible moment that he had killed his daughter in every way that mattered. Not physically, but spiritually, emotionally, intellectually. The person she had been was gone forever, erased by his ambition and arrogance, and it was entirely his fault. His first instinct, honed by decades of managing crises and controlling narratives, was damage control on a scale he had never attempted before. He couldn't let anyone know what had really happened, couldn't let the truth about the lobotomy destroy his family's reputation and political future. The solution he had sought to protect the Kennedy image had created a far worse threat to that same image. So he made his second terrible decision, compounding the first with the deception that would poison his family for generations. He would hide Rosemary away in an institution and pretend the lobotomy had never happened. When Rose returned from their Cape Cod home, expecting to visit her recovering daughter and hear good news about her condition, Joe told her that Rosemary had suffered severe setbacks and needed to be permanently institutionalized for her own safety. He didn't tell her about the surgery, couldn't bring himself to admit what he had authorized, couldn't bear to see the horror and accusation that would fill her eyes. He couldn't face her rage, couldn't endure her questions, couldn't admit that his arrogance and impatience had destroyed their daughter. Rose's breakdown when she finally saw Rosemary's true condition became one of the defining traumas of Joe's remaining years. The way she screamed when she realized the extent of the damage, the way she collapsed against the hospital wall, the way she looked at him afterward with a mixture of rage, devastation, and disbelief that never fully left her eyes. "What did you do to our daughter?" she whispered. And Joe Kennedy couldn't answer, because the truth was too horrible to speak aloud, too damning to confess even to his wife. The guilt began eating at him immediately, consuming him from the inside with a corrosive intensity that no amount of success could neutralize. Every political victory felt hollow and meaningless when he thought about Rosemary sitting in that Wisconsin institution, unable to understand why her family had abandoned her. Every newspaper article praising the Kennedy family's success felt like cruel mockery when he knew the dark truth behind their perfect public image. Every business triumph rang false when measured against the magnitude of what he had lost. Joe Kennedy had built his entire identity and empire on his ability to control everything around him, to bend every situation to his will through a combination of money, influence, and sheer force of personality. But he couldn't control this catastrophe he had created. He couldn't undo what he had authorized, couldn't bring his daughter back from the mental wasteland where his decision had stranded her. And this complete powerlessness in the face of irreversible consequences drove him toward the edge of psychological breakdown. He began drinking more heavily than ever before, sleeping fitfully when he slept at all, flying into terrifying rages over minor business setbacks that wouldn't have bothered him in the past. His business associates and political contacts noticed the change in his demeanor, but attributed it to the stress of wartime business pressures and the challenges of managing such a large family's various interests. They had no idea that their powerful associate was slowly being destroyed by guilt that grew heavier with each passing day. As the years passed with agonizing slowness, Joe Kennedy's guilt manifested in increasingly desperate ways that alarmed those closest to him. He threw himself into his remaining children's political careers with an obsession that bordered on mania, working 18-hour days to advance Jack's congressional ambitions, Bobby's legal career, and Ted's political potential. These became his way of justifying what he had done to Rosemary, a kind of psychological penance that might give meaning to her sacrifice. If the Kennedy name could achieve unprecedented greatness, if his sons could reach the highest levels of American power, maybe Rosemary's destruction would have served some larger purpose. But the more successful his other children became, the more hollow and meaningless their victories felt to him. Every triumph was shadowed by the knowledge that one Kennedy child had been sacrificed for the other's success, that their political dynasty was built on a foundation of betrayal and medical barbarism. Jack's speeches about American ideals felt like personal indictments. Bobby's work on justice issues seemed to mock his own injustice toward Rosemary. Joe's relationship with Rose never recovered from the deception and horror of that terrible decision. She eventually learned the complete truth about the lobotomy through her own investigation, and while she never directly confronted him about his unilateral decision to authorize the surgery, a coldness settled between them that lasted for the rest of their marriage. They continued to live in the same house, attended the same social functions, presented a united front to the world when necessary, but the warmth and partnership that had once characterized their relationship was gone forever. Rose had lost her daughter, but she had also lost her faith in the man she had trusted to protect their family. Their conversations became purely functional, focused on managing the other children's careers and maintaining the family's public image. Joe began making what he privately called pilgrimages to see Rosemary at St. Coletta, though he never used that religious term aloud. These were quick, secret visits that he scheduled when he was traveling on business nearby, always alone, always brief, always devastating. He would sit with her for an hour or two, trying desperately to detect any sign of recognition, any hint that some part of the daughter he had destroyed might still exist behind those vacant eyes. He would talk to her about family news, business successes, political developments, as if she could understand and respond to his updates. But Rosemary never recognized him as her father or anyone else significant. To her damaged mind, he was just another visitor in an endless parade of strangers who appeared and disappeared without explanation. These visits tortured Joe Kennedy in ways he had never imagined possible. He would leave St. Coletta in tears, sometimes driving for hours through the Wisconsin countryside before he could compose himself enough to return to his hotel and resume his normal business facade. The powerful man who had intimidated Wall Street titans and Hollywood moguls was reduced to sobbing in his car outside a rural institution, begging a daughter who couldn't hear him for forgiveness she couldn't grant, and wouldn't understand if she could. His business associates began noticing increasingly erratic behavior that couldn't be explained by normal stress or aging. Joe would sometimes stop mid-conversation during important meetings and stare into space, lost in memories of Rosemary's laughter before the surgery robbed her of joy. He would explode with disproportionate rage over minor problems that previously wouldn't have bothered him, then slip into deep depressions that lasted for days and made him unreachable to family and colleagues. Friends and associates attributed these mood swings to the natural effects of aging and the enormous stress of managing such a complex business and political empire. But Joe knew the truth. He was being slowly destroyed by the weight of what he had done, consumed by guilt that grew heavier rather than lighter with the passage of time. The irony wasn't lost on him that as his sons gained increasing political power, partly built on the foundation of their family's carefully maintained perfect image, he was becoming powerless against his own psychological torment. When Jack Kennedy announced his presidential campaign in 1960, Joe felt both triumph and terror in equal measure. This was the culmination of everything he had worked for since the 1920s, the vindication of the Kennedy dynasty and proof that an Irish Catholic family could reach the highest levels of American power. But it also meant unprecedented scrutiny of the family's past, more probing questions from journalists about their history, and exponentially greater risk that someone would discover what had happened to Rosemary. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and Joe knew that any revelation about the lobotomy would destroy not just Jack's candidacy, but the entire Kennedy legacy. During the campaign, Joe became obsessed with controlling every detail of the family narrative with a precision that bordered on paranoia. He hired private investigators to monitor journalists who might be digging into the Kennedy family history, paying them substantial retainers to track down leads and warn him of potential problems. He made generous donations to institutions and charities that might have records related to Rosemary's condition or treatment, ensuring their continued cooperation and silence. He even seriously considered moving Rosemary to an even more remote facility, though he ultimately couldn't bring himself to uproot her again from the only stable environment she had known. The stress of managing a presidential campaign while hiding such a massive family secret began taking a severe physical toll on Joe's health. He suffered his first minor stroke in late 1960, just months after Jack's successful election, collapsing in his Palm Beach home during what should have been a celebration. Doctors attributed the stroke to the excitement and enormous pressure of the campaign, but those closest to him suspected something deeper and more troubling was affecting his health. The stroke left Joe partially paralyzed on his left side and with significant difficulty speaking clearly, but his mental anguish remained as sharp and torturous as ever, perhaps made worse by his reduced ability to manage and control the situation. During Jack's presidency, Joe watched from the sidelines of political power as his son implemented progressive policies supporting people with disabilities and mental health initiatives. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him that the president who spoke so eloquently about helping society's most vulnerable members was the brother of a woman they had locked away and systematically forgotten. Every speech Jack gave about human dignity and equal treatment felt like a personal indictment of Joe's decision. Every policy initiative supporting disabled Americans seemed to highlight the hypocrisy of their family's private behavior. Joe's final years were marked by increasing isolation, depression, and an overwhelming need for confession that he could never quite bring himself to fulfill. He would spend hours alone in his study, staring at family photographs from before 1941, when Rosemary was still a visible part of their lives and their family seemed genuinely complete. He kept one particular photograph on his bedside table where he could see it every morning and evening. Rosemary at age 22, laughing at some long-forgotten family gathering, beautiful and alive and whole. It was the last picture taken before he authorized her destruction, and it became his most treasured and most torturous possession. As his health continued to decline and he became increasingly aware of his mortality, Joe became consumed with the desperate need to confess his sin, to somehow make amends for the irreversible damage he had caused. He wrote long, rambling letters to Rosemary that he never sent, filled with apologies for decisions she couldn't understand, addressed to a mind that couldn't process forgiveness even if it were offered. He spoke to priests about unnamed sins during confession, seeking absolution for crimes he couldn't bring himself to fully confess, hoping that somehow God would understand and forgive what he couldn't bring himself to say. In his increasingly rare lucid moments, Joe would call his surviving children to his bedside, seeming to want desperately to tell them something important about their family's past. But he could never find the words, could never overcome the shame and fear that had kept him silent for decades, could never bring himself to admit what he had done to their sister. Today, more than 50 years after that first competition in Chicago, Special Olympics serves over 5 million athletes in nearly 200 countries and territories around the world. What began as one woman's desperate response to her sister's tragedy has become the world's largest sports organization dedicated to people with intellectual disabilities, touching virtually every nation and culture on Earth. Athletes compete in over 30 Olympic-type sports, from basketball to bocce ball, from swimming to skiing, from tennis to track and field. But the impressive numbers and statistics only tell part of the story, only capture the quantifiable aspects of a movement that has fundamentally transformed human attitudes and social structures. The real impact of Special Olympics can be measured in changed hearts, opened minds, and millions of individual lives transformed from isolation to inclusion, from shame to pride, from exclusion to celebration. Families no longer automatically hide their children with intellectual disabilities in back bedrooms or distant institutions, following the tragic Kennedy example that dominated American culture for generations. Schools actively include rather than systematically exclude students with cognitive differences, recognizing that diversity strengthens rather than weakens educational communities. Communities celebrate rather than stigmatize people with intellectual disabilities, creating opportunities for participation instead of barriers to involvement. The pervasive shame that once surrounded intellectual disability in American and global culture has been largely replaced by understanding, acceptance, and recognition of human worth that transcends cognitive ability. Eunice Kennedy Shriver died in August 2009 at the age of 88, having lived long enough to witness her movement transform the world in ways she had only dreamed of during those early painful visits to see her sister. Her funeral was attended by Special Olympics athletes from around the globe, people whose lives had been fundamentally changed by her vision of inclusion and dignity. Her refusal to accept that cognitive differences meant social exclusion. Many of these athletes had never heard the name Rosemary Kennedy or learned about the sister whose tragedy had inspired the movement that gave their lives meaning and recognition. But they were living proof that something beautiful and transformative could grow from even the deepest pain, that human tragedy could be redeemed through love, determination, and the refusal to accept injustice as inevitable. Rosemary Kennedy died in January 2005, 4 years before Eunice, at the age of 86. She never knew about Special Olympics or understood that her suffering had led to so much hope and achievement for others. She never experienced the joy of competition, the thrill of recognition, the pride of accomplishment that her tragedy had made possible for millions of people around the world. But in a very real way, she lived to see the transformed world her sister had built from the ashes of her destruction. The institution where she spent her final decades was no longer the cold, isolating warehouse for unwanted people it had been when she arrived in 1941. It had been transformed by the same movement her sister had founded, becoming a place of warmth, dignity, individual attention, and respect for human worth regardless of cognitive ability. When historians examine the Kennedy legacy in decades to come, they will undoubtedly focus on the obvious political achievements, the presidency that inspired a generation, the legislation that advanced civil rights, the moments of national leadership that defined critical periods in American history. But perhaps the most lasting and meaningful Kennedy contribution to human civilization came not from political power or public office, but from private pain transformed into public purpose. Rosemary's story, hidden in shame for nearly half a century, eventually became the catalyst for one of the most significant civil rights movements of the 20th century. The girl who was systematically erased from family photos became the inspiration for a movement that made millions of people visible to their communities. The daughter, who was surgically silenced, gave voice to countless others who had been denied the right to be heard. The sister who was abandoned and forgotten became the reason other siblings learned to advocate fiercely and include unconditionally. From the ashes of one family's most shameful secret grew a global celebration of human potential and dignity, living proof that even the darkest chapters of our personal and collective history can become sources of light, hope, and transformative change for generations yet to be born.